कीजिएगा. Now, this is supposed to be a new reflection on the life of Camões. And I would request you may copy, take whatever notes, but this I will give to my eminent colleague, to Sushanji. You will have it anyway, but what I would love you to do is to put question marks at some places where you do not understand or where you object. And I may be wrong also. I may have contradicted myself with what I said yesterday. So please try to cooperate. And at the end of this, you can say a few things. And I will try to link the story of his life, at least whatever I could recover from my archives, and the notion of epic poet, an epic poem, by asking myself a few questions. The status of the poet in 16th century, the status of the poet, of this poet compared to Virgile, and compared to other poets of the same times in mid-16th century. So, in 1424, he was born in Lisbon from a so-called noble family, but not so rich, living in the Muraria. Now we have one first obstacle regarding the biography of supposedly great poets, Legend is also there. Whether it is Virgile or Camões, there are things that are said. We cannot prove whether they are true or not. We lack of real documents. And very often, documents that we have, they are fake. So of course, he had theoretically noble ancestry coming from Galicia, northern West Spain now. But I have mixed feelings about it. Now, according to his own testimony, his mother died when he was born. This has come later. For a long, long time, it was thought that he was living with his family in that poorer side of Lisbon, Mouraria, the quarter of the Moors. And we discovered by an internal analysis of his poetry that he was not brought up by his mother. He was brought up by a severe stepmother. So he says. And in 1430, he's still very, very young, you see, he lost his father. Now this is a very important point, because in those days, losing your father was losing the living proof of your status. He had his uncle on his father's side, who was a canon, that is he was a scholar in theology and Chancellor of the new University of Coimbra, something you should not forget. In the convent of Santa Cruz, the convent of Santa Cruz was a separate entity created by the king also, and you see, it was a way of fighting church that was coming from Spain or directly from the Pope, like the Jesuits. He was also Chancellor of the newly created University of Coimbra. Now, there's an interesting thing. In something like 1520, there was an epidemic of town को क्या कहते हैं अंग्रेजी में? Town. La peste? Plague. There was a supposedly epidemic of plague in Lisbon, and the king took it as a pretext to go out of the capital, to go to Coimbra, and then founded a new university that would not depend so much on the pro-Spanish church. So he entered the university in 1538. He entered the University of Coimbra, and for 3 years he studied classical authors. And this is something quite important because we are puzzled. He quotes so many Greek authors, while in those days reading Greek was very difficult. It had started becoming fashionable again through the French university. And it was considered as a bad thing by the Catholic Church. Now, who can tell me why? I know this is a difficult question. Why was Greek studies, why were they banned by the Catholic Church? Well,
because Greek was associated with previous paganism.
oh, it is much more practical than that. Greek had become the religious language of Constantinople, the rival church, the so-called Orthodox. You see, and it was a strong rival power to this extent that the Italian and the French had tried to conquest Constantinople, Christians against Christians, like Camões says. So, with the Renaissance, there was a coming back of classical studies, and also, as I told you, with the Protestant ideas, there was a will sort of to shake off the classical knowledge of the Catholic Church and to come back to the Bible. Studying the Bible was prohibited for the ordinary Catholics. It was only the Church. The Protestant and the Renaissance people did not like it anymore. So Greek was a major language of the New Testament, not Latin. So he studied for 3 years in the university. Now we do not know because he quotes so many Greek authors. People would think, oh, he must have read Homer. I have my doubt. He was not able to read Greek. That was too difficult. And they were ill-equipped. But what they had were compendia, sort of small encyclopedia with ready-made quotations of so many authors. Even for maritime techniques. So he studied that in Coimbra. He had a year of theology because of his uncle, Canon, in the convent of Santa Cruz, which was sort of an annex of the University of Coimbra. But we know that he did not like it. Precisely because, obviously because those Protestant ideas that were circulating. And very young he was dreaming of becoming a poet, not a clerk, not a religious man. So logically he refuses to become a priest. This is readable? Yes? I'm surprised. So, contrary to the views of his uncle. Now, there was also a new thing at the end of Middle Ages. Celibacy of the priest became compulsory. Throughout Middle Ages, there was no compulsion of celibacy for the ordinary priest. And by the way, even after that, well. So, he was against this injunction of celibacy. And that was also a reason of his refusal to become a priest. Now he turns to writing poetry because he knew that writing poetry the Italian way was a way of telling big people, hello, I know the fashionable writings. I know, I know Italian, which was not a difficult thing in those days. But still, I know the novel art of writing poetry that came from Sicily, with the rhymes at the end. I know the sonnet, He had studied that in spite of his uncle's idea. Of course, his uncle was totally against it because this new school of poetry was revisiting Latin and Greek mythology and in between the lines criticizing the school of theology of the Catholic Church. So he thought that he had a ticket, if I may say, for going to the court. As a young noble, he was considered as a suitable cadet. Not married, no much of money. Well, the ideal prey for the king military school and naval school. So he was becoming a cadet. But in his mind, poetry was more important. Well, you have to have a living. So when he comes to the court, he's already a good poet. He entered the court cadet school, already a young fashionable poet, writing sonnets, following the Italian and Spanish new school like Garcilaso de la Vega. Garcilaso de la Vega is the first ever Spanish-speaking poet who wrote the Italian way and who wrote according to the fashion of Sicily. You know that island in south of Italian peninsula. Garcilaso de la Vega was a soldier and a poet. Garcilaso never wrote any epics as far as I know. And he died very early. He was not 30, but already a famous poet. He died fighting the French in southern France, in Catalonia. But in those days, it was a tiny world. Poets, especially soldier poets, they knew each other. There was another one, Boscan, also a Spaniard. They were belonging to the aristocracy, but they needed to have a military career because, you see, landed aristocracy was not so powerful. They needed that. But to justify their noble status, they needed new poetry, you know. And in order to understand the ideas of young Camões, you have to know about this context. He was so deeply moved when he learned the death of Garcilaso de la Vega that there is a passage in his epics that is telling to France, "Oh, you are killing good Christians." And in those days, everybody knew what it was about. So the former Garcilaso de la Vega, being a valiant soldier and poet, her model he probably wanted to follow. In any case, his reputation as a seducer of ladies of the court, marred his uncle's projects for a career in Catholic theology. And because of his, I would say, audacity, because of his poetry and his attitude in the poetic court of the king's daughter, he is exiled from the court to a village in Ribatejo. Ribatejo means the shore of the Tagus River, the big river of Lisbon. So he was sent to the countryside, where there was nobody to talk to. And why? Because he was guilty of having, through his poems, he had courted a princess, Catarina de Ataide and Aragon. Aragon was a Spanish kingdom, a very strong one in those days. So belonging to that family was almost being a king. And that princess was perhaps the number 2 of the poetic court of the king's daughter. So the Ataide and Aragon family, they complained. His nobility was doubtful, first thing. He was low ranking, and he has not enough money to become a suitor to the princess. So they said, this is an insult. He should be exiled. And what kind of poetry did he write first? This is quite interesting. Just like Virgile, he wrote eclogas. Echo in Greek means green, like in ecology, greenery. Eclogos is normally a poem that is inspired by nature. But it became really something else, because the classical form of eclogue is eclogue. Originally it was eclogue, but it is eclogue, at least in English. This I had to check. And his eclogues, like Virgile's model, actually, that was, it was a dialogue between two shepherds. And there is on one side one shepherd who is the bad one and the good one on the other side. And they talk about, of course, about their duty of guarding the sheep, etc. Yes. But in their dialogue, there is competition, poetic competition with music about love poems. And that was already, you see, not very well tolerated with the conservative royal court. So through these his eclogues, he courted the princess openly. It is said that the princess answered positively. That was worse than ever, you know. So he was already becoming a famous poet while sent to exile. He was allowed to come back to the Lisbon court very quickly, actually, in 1546.
So will you scroll down?
Yes.
Upper part has
Uh,
yes. Thank
yes, yeah, I'm scrolling like a volume in Latin. Now, may I carry on?
you. Yes.
In any way, you will get this text. And this is easy to communicate, it has no images. In 1546, he was allowed to come back to the Lisbon court. He still enjoys some protection, you know, from his uncle. Because his uncle, he is puzzled. He has no son, and his uncle is thinking that somehow I have to save the dignity of the house. So somehow we cannot abandon him, though he is a bad lad. So the chancellor of the new Coimbra University is a powerful person, very powerful, close to the king. And the Aragon family, of course they were an important family, but there was a kind of cloud over it, because the Aragon were, of course, the Aragon family were linked to the Spanish Aragon. So, as a way of running away, he agrees to go for military service in Ceuta, in northern Morocco, in the Strait of Gibraltar. Oh yes, Ceuta is Sipta, the seventh fortress in Arabic. Like they had 7 prayers in those days. Gibraltar is Jebel Tariq, from the name of the so-called Arab conqueror. He was not Arab at all, but that's it. Arab conqueror of Spain, Tariq bin Ziyad. Jebel is the mountain. Jebel Tariq, Gibraltar. You see, in those days, Ceuta was a Portuguese possession. And that was in the line of the supposed reconquest of Iberia over the Moors. And they remembered that northern Africa had been a Roman and Visigoth, that is German kingdom, before being an Arab kingdom. So logically they would say, oh yes, we should conquer northern Africa. But the Portuguese were bad at it actually. It was a failure. And the Spaniards were slightly better. He might have had some mixed feelings about military career, but you see, he could not, there was no other possible option for him, so he had to carry on. There he fought under the Count of Noronha, who was the governor of Ceuta in those days. And it's an important detail to note, because this noble family, the Noronha, they were close to the ideas of Coimbra University. And Noronha protected him as long as he could. And when Noronha became governor or viceroy in Goa, he protected his young soldier poet. Now there was one thing, he lost one eye. So, there is a French proverb, bonjour lunette, adieu fillette. That is, if you have bad eyes, you can say goodbye to your loves. He's back to Lisbon in 1552. But then he has a quarrel. Am I eligible? Yes. He has a quarrel with a pious young man from the court, a protégé. You understand what a protégé is? A favorite person, protected, who was taking part in the Corpus procession, you know. It was understood as an act of piety to lead the banners and to wear the banners of Christ and Virgin Mary, etc. And Saint Santo Antonio, who is the patron of Lisbon, you know. So, holding the banners was something very much sought of. People would even give money to the congregation to be allowed to do it. And other people who were not in the procession, they were supposed to cross themselves and take off their hats as a sign of respect. Camões did neither. So he had a violent dispute with that young man. And that was reported to the Inquisition. And that was considered as a very serious offense. Again, he...
Sir, can you scroll it back?
I'm trying to do that.
Yes.
Because my document is a very crude one, very bad one. I made it hastily. So, the matter was sent to the Tribunal of Inquisition. What was Inquisition? Inquisition was an institution that had come, sorry for that, from France. And they were supposed to persecute people who were not good Catholics. And Inquisition was becoming a strong stronghold of the Catholic Church in front of the Protestant movement. And also the Inquisition was very cruel and very severe against the converted people, the former Jews and Muslims. Those people were needed by the king because they were good scholars, sometimes good soldiers also, knowing Arabic, which was the language of the day if you wanted to go on the sea. And of course the king was, and the university was always having a trouble with the Inquisition. And the Inquisition was also, oh yes, you look like a very good student. I'm flattered. So the Inquisition had become a state within the state. And for nearly 100 years, within the Portuguese kingdom, there was a dilemma with the Inquisition. Do we obey the Catholic Church with the Inquisition in our expansion, desire against the Muslim world? Or do we use this Muslim and Jew elite to carry on our expansion project? And for a long time, the Portuguese crown chose the second option precisely because the Spaniards were doing the contrary. The Spaniards very early were trying to expel or persecute the former Muslim and Jews who sought refuge in Portugal and became very influential in Portugal. So, naturally, Camões was very much aware of that. And in the whole of his career, he was against the Inquisition. He was also in favor of having treaties with people of the East, not massacring. So, but his career was there, he was also on a difficult dilemma. So the matter is referred to the Tribunal of the Inquisition, that he had refused to honor the Corpus Christi procession, the procession of the body of Christ. So he was thought to be a kind of Protestant, He was sent to jail for 1 year and even more. But we don't know exactly how long he was in jail. So again, he pleaded with the court to be allowed to go back to military service. And this time, he had thought it of, after the Ceuta affair and after Noronha had become a viceroy of Portuguese India, so-called. So he thought that I have a career there. I want to go there. But the Inquisition opposed. Well, do we send this kind of Protestant man, to Goa? Nevertheless, Noronha did help him, and after 1 year and a half in jail, his plea was ignored. They turned a blind eye on his demands. Let me go to Goa. I will do whatever is necessary. I will be a good soldier. Forgive me. No. So for 1 year and a half, we don't know whether it was house arrest or a jail, but there is an institution in Lisbon, still called Casa da India, where we have records of people sent to India. And there it is said that he was not free of movement for more than 1 year and a half. They wouldn't say openly jail, but I suppose it was jail. And believe me, the Inquisition jail, it was not a joke. It was worse than the king's jail. That's why I say we don't know whether it was outside arrest of jail. And India being a possible carrier for young and penniless nobility, and also because Noronha was appointed Viceroy of Goa, and Noronha appreciated him. He was a good soldier, and Noronha also, his ideology was close to the ideology of the university. So, finally, his request is granted for military service in Goa. He embarked from Goa, from Lisbon in March 1553. Why March? You see, in those days, you couldn't decide to, oh, we sail ahead. No, you had to wait for favorable winds. So, yes?
They have to wait for February
Winds. Winds. Winds.
Normally with this thing you get a different kind of thing.
Yeah. Yes. Just like here, by the way. So, he embarks on a vessel that was a friend of Noronha also. He is already an accomplished poet with good knowledge in Latin literature, but also in geography. Knowing that he would be going to India, he had cared to listen to lessons of geography. Greek geography by an author called Strabo. So he had read the Greek geographer Strabo, but through Latin. Again, we have doubts as to his knowledge of Greek. Probably through Latin summaries, like for other Greek writers, he used compendia, just like encyclopedia. Compendia is the neutral plural of compendium, just like we have opus, opera. He also studied maritime techniques, which was something not very well accepted by the court because it was a secret. And maritime routes were secrets also. Let me tell you about a very interesting episode. We are in 1530, around 1530, when the Portuguese are fighting very hard against the Sultan of Gujarat. And the Sultan of Gujarat had a powerful navy and was even helped by the Turks against the Portuguese. And there was a decisive victory, a battle by some Portuguese against the Sultan. They wanted to inform the court before anybody else. You know, informing the court was a way of gaining prestige. If you were the first to bring the good news you would become a famous man. So a Portuguese military officer, he took a small Indian boat. They call it in Portuguese it is called fusta. Fusta, F-U-S-T-A. But I still don't know what kind of boat was that. But it was a Gujarati boat, and an excellent one. A small one, but they used to sail it straight to Mecca. And this Portuguese man, he knew how to maneuver the boat. He took it straight to Lisbon without any problem, proving that this boat and this way of navigating was far superior than the Portuguese boats, Portuguese vessels, big vessels, and the knowledge of the stars were far better. So he reaches Lisbon to announce the novel of the news, the good news of victory. Do you know what happens to the Indian vessel? It was burnt to ashes because the Portuguese navy said, hi, they are better than us. So nobody should know about this kind of ship. Nobody should know about his route. They didn't burn the man, but they burnt everything else. So this tells you one thing, that actually a former friend of mine, she wrote a theory about the flaws of Portuguese navy even in those days that were not openly disclosed. And Camões was aware of that. He had a lot of respect for that. So it is supposed that he might have traveled with his books. Because you see, the internal criticism of his work reveals that he quotes so many Latin and Greek writers and writers from Spain and France, etc., especially about history, historiography. How could it possibly have such a huge memory? That is impossible. So we suppose that he traveled with his books. He must have arrived at Goa 6 or 7 months after his departure from Lisbon. In any case, in Goa, the court of the Viceroy was also animated by poetic contests. You understand what I mean? Muqabla. So they were having poetic games. I'm better than you, and I shall sing better. Well, excuse me. So he comes, before being a soldier again, he comes to a poetic court. Noronha and his successors would praise themselves as being highly cultivated people, highly learnt people. What we know is, while on board the Portuguese vessel São Bento, that was in his uncle's name also, under the command of the famous Captain Alvarez Cabral, en route to Goa, we suppose that he started planning his epic. Now, this has been said by Da Pimenta Pimpão was a very famous Portuguese literary critique. He studied very deeply the text of Camões and says that, well, you say that he started writing his epics from the very moment, from the first strophe. Oh, by the way, in Spanish, in Portuguese and Italian, the word was stanza. Stanza, 8 verses, stanza. Like a stand, a construction. So, the legend was that he started writing the first stanza on the boat, inspired by the sea, etc. But the literary critique said, well, this is totally impossible. Because if you have the idea of an epic, and you have models for that, Homer, Virgile, etc. So you first plan it. And that is not done like that. So the idea that he really positively wrote on board is half truth. He must have taken some months also to plan his work. And planning the work, the epics, more or less 8,000 verses, not a joke. You don't need so many books for that. It is much more plausible that you can sort of dream of and reflect on the plan of your epic poem rather than positively writing. It's more logical. And then he comes to the court of the Viceroy of Goa. So we suppose that he started planning his epic with Vasco da Gama first expedition as a subject. It is quite obvious that this first sea voyage gave him food for thought and it inspired him in many ways. Practically speaking, if you want to describe a storm at sea, if you have not lived through it, well, you will lack of imagination. So I suppose that his first sea voyage gave him food for thought and inspired him in many ways. Also, he was in contact with former sailors who were doing a second voyage to Goa. One of them was Veloso, or supposed to be. So, when you are on board, when the weather is good, when you have nothing to do, what do? We tell each other stories. And precisely, the experienced people would tell stories. That was also a source of inspiration. The telling of stories within the story, you see. This is something very much natural, and it goes well with the oral literature concept that was at the root of epic poetry. Now, on this oral literature concept, I will come back on it, because naturally we have great changes. (1553) It is said that he composed the cantus, songs 1, 2, 3 while traveling, and also later in Goa. And I think it is most probably that he was better, much better, once on shore. Goa was then the Portuguese, the capital of so-called Portuguese India. And that, you see, Portuguese India, in those days, they had, I would say, a colonial concept of India. It was rather the Indies, because that would include Malaysia. Well, in that sense, they were not wrong, because in Malaysia, the Indian influence was there from always. Whether it had been Hindu Indians or Muslim Indians, they were Indians all the way, actually. The administration of the ports, the Shah Bandar in Malaysia in Portuguese time, in 16th century time, all of them were Indian, actually. So, for the Portuguese to call it Indies or India, whenever they would go, there was there a commerce, a trade done by Indians and Persians also. But for them, Persians were Indian, you know. Actually, there was such a mixture of culture there. So, the concept of India was very large. It would include Sumatra, it would include Singapore. Singapore. Such an Indian name, you know. Singha, the lion, and Pur, the city. So, logically. And Goa was supposed to be the capital of it all. Of course, it was on the paper. But there was something true that all the time they were having fights all over in the name of Portuguese domination. And spice trade. Spice trade. So Goa then was the capital of Portuguese India. When Camões landed in Goa, the famous Jesuit College of St. Paul, founded near 1542, was already teaching theology, but also classical Latin literature and Portuguese language to some 400 students. Most of them Indian, but Indian nobility. Now we touch upon a very important phenomenon. The expansion of Jesuit power. Jesuits, they originally were founded by a soldier, a Basque soldier. He hardly knew any Spanish, by the way. Loyola, Xavier. Xavier is the name of a tiny village in Basque country. And so is Loyola. So, these people, they were soldiers, but rather former soldiers, and they would not agree with the aggressive military policy of Spain and Portugal. They said, no, if we want to convince these people, we have to teach the elite. We have to win them from inside. And of course, Haj ka Baj. Baj ka Baj. Of course, you understand what I mean. So, of course, the religious purpose is there, but the trade purpose is there also. In those days, Rome was a political power. Rome was an Italian kingdom which needed lots of money. There was no Italian unity, and there was constant war between the French, the Spaniards, and the Germans over Italian soil, and the only resisting strength was the Pope. So, the fraternity of Jesuits was created, It was created like an army, but an army without weapons. And their main weapon was creating colleges in Asia. Make no mistake, their idea was still Christian domination, but through trade and exchange of learning. In those days, that was quite revolutionary, and that was not at all agreeable to the so-called glorious Spanish and Portuguese king, who were resting on the strength of the sword. You know what a bayonet is? Do you know what a bayonet is? No? It is a gun with a sword at the end.
You should know
Bayonet.
Indian police people all this stuff.
So when you have finished
Rifle with a
with a long knife, a kind of sword. So when you had finished with your powder, and when the enemy was too close, then you would put the bayonet into your gun and, fight like this. Why do I say this? Because there is a... Just excuse me. Yeah. No, but why do I see this? Because the Jesuits, they had long understood that founding power on the crude use of weapon would not last. Napoleon understood that for a moment also. At the end of his life, he said, you cannot build your power over bayonets. You cannot sit on it for long. So the Jesuits, they became a state within the state, directly competing with the Inquisition. And of course, when Camões lands in Goa, he founds favorable ears. And he founds again a library, quite a big one. And as the Jesuits were also doing trade, they didn't lack of maritime and geographical knowledge. So we suppose that his staying in Goa also favored his literary creativity. Not the romantic idea that he would always, write on board, and that is a bit, I would say, of a legend. Hey. Yes. Can you read it well? Yes? So when Camões landed in Goa, the famous Jesuit College of St. Paul, founded in 1542, 10 years before. So it was a beautiful start. He was already, the college was already teaching theology, but also classical Latin literature and Portuguese language to some 400, most of them Indian elite students, a library, a hospital, and the first ever printing press in India were hosted by the St. Paul College. It was already a university, actually. A kind of reproducing the new University of Coimbra. And, to bring a printing press was something extraordinary. First of all, a printing press in those days, that would be a huge thing to carry. You were needing a special ship for that. And lots of money, of course. and they established a printing press in spite of the Inquisition, in spite of the king's will, because normally printing, which was quite a new thing in those days, printing was closely watched by the church and the priest and by the king. You would need a privilege from the court and from the church. In Portuguese it is called alvará, a word from Latin anyway, from Arabic. But you would need protection, money, and good attitude, and a good text, revised, corrected, censored, to be in order to go to print in Portugal. In Goa, there was a kind of freedom thanks to the Jesuits. So much so that they printed Garcia da Horta. In spite of the opposition, in spite of the Inquisition, sorry. So, the college was hosting a hospital. Garcia da Horta's book is also for medicine. And the first ever printing press in India were hosted by the St. Paul College, St. Paul College. Now, why St. Paul? St. Paul was, in Christ's time, he was a Jew with Roman citizenship, in charge of fighting against the bad Jews, or supposedly the people who were coming after Christ, who were following Christ. So he was a persecutor of whoever was opposed to Roman emperors and to the cult of Roman emperors. In Christ's time, you see, a big political offense was not to offer incense and prayers to the statue of the emperor. The emperor was a divinity. So Simon, later called St. Paul, was in charge of looking for people who were not agreeable to the Roman ideology. And on his way to his duties, it is said that Christ appeared to him and he converted. Paulus in Latin means a small one, and he may have chosen this name for humility purpose. So St. Paul was a model for the Jesuits because he was a convert, because he was a very learned man, because he had renounced military career, just like Loyola. And St. Paul became the founder saint of the Jesuits. Did I make myself clear? To this day, Jesuit colleges are called Paulista. In Brazil, São Paulo, the city, is from that college. So it was a very, very important intellectual and colonial movement, of course. The court of the Viceroy, therefore, was not lacking of intellectual concept. In spite of the recently established Inquisition tribunal in Goa. Oh yes, now I have the liberty of writing. The Inquisition in Goa comes and it is not very well accepted anyway, in 1535, officially. But the local viceroys do not welcome it, because it is actually a hindrance. Some Portuguese nobles and viceroys, they had understood the importance of collaborating with the local Hindu elite. Whether they were converted or not, being practical. The Inquisition became a problem. And the establishment of the college, the Jesuit college in Goa, was probably a direct response of the Portuguese elite against the Inquisition. And also direct response of the Roman part of the court of the Pope. They were also against the Inquisition, because Inquisition was somehow a force that was linked with local churches, Portugal, France, and Spain, etc. While the Roman authority, the Pope authority, wanted to be supreme. And for that the Jesuits came very much at hand. They were not responsible, they would not answer to the king, they would answer to the Pope only. So, in spite of the recently established Inquisition of Goa, Inquisition Tribunal in Goa, and this here I should have mentioned the date, 1535. Again, it was not welcome. Because the Portuguese, many of them understood very well that their power was fragile. You see, Vasco da Gama makes his first trip in 1497-99. We are more than 60 years after when Camões comes to Goa. So things were already deteriorating. The Dutch were becoming stronger and stronger, and Protestant enemies, and also the Spaniard kingdom was threatening the Brazil possessions of Portugal. So these were extremely difficult times, and very quickly Camões understood that. And that's why he would rather sit with the Jesuits. And very quickly he understood that the battle was lost in most sides. But he couldn't say openly. So he is said to have composed most of the epic poem from 53 to 1568, while being in Asia, in India and Southeast Asia. Now again, I think it is quite foolish to think that, in one hand he would have the sword, in the other hand he would write. That was impossible. Actually, he had so many periods of jail. He was time and time again sent to jail because of his former enemies. Are you following me, lady? Are you following me? Are you following me? Yes? I hope so. Yes. So he, one thing that is not that we know of really, that whenever he was sent to prison or to exile, then he was no more a soldier, then he would write. And something very strange that the Inquisition, some viceroys, none of them, well, one viceroy would last 3 years in Goa only. 3 years. And most of his postings, Camões was never posted abroad, in Asia, more than 2 years. So he had always periods, I wouldn't say of leisure, because it was rather jail than leisure, but he never stopped writing in those periods. So much for legend. So he is said to have composed most of the epic poem, most of his epic poem, Os Lusíadas. In English it is the Lusíadas, with an S, I think. While being in India and Southeast Asia. 1554, February to November, Camões took part in a military expedition to the Strait of Hormuz. You know the Strait of Hormuz? It is there that you have Bahrain. So the Strait of Hormuz. Hormuz is a Persian god from the times of the Avesta. Hormuz. And the Arab word for it is the confluence, Doab. There is a Hindi word for that also, the confluence of two rivers.
Yes.
So, please tell me. Sangam, yes. So the Sangam, where Qatar is, etc., it is called Bahrain. Bahrain means in Arabic two seas or two rivers. You see, merging two rivers. Thank you. So it's quite interesting that in classical Arabic, like in classical Sanskrit, like in Latin, in Greek, not in Latin, in Greek, there is no major difference between river as a sacred entity and the sea. So he goes to Bahrain and to Hormuz in that strait, and there they have a very difficult battle against the Turks, against whoever is there, the Persians also. So it is very difficult, because in those days the Abbasid Caliphate of Iran, after Shah Abbas, with the creation of Bandar Abbas, the port of Abbas, the Shia, the Shia religious and political power was becoming bigger and bigger. So there, the Portuguese could not have a very firm position, and they were losing. And Camões became very much aware of that. That influenced again his ideas, and said, well, I should talk about this, I should tell the king that here this is not a favorable enterprise that we are having. This is not going to be a good future. One of the functions of the epic poem is to predict. You see? And in the epic poem, you have so-called prophecies, vaticinium, prophecies. And he manages in his poem to have so-called prophecies of the time of Vasco da Gama related to prison time, actually. And that was one of his main functions of prophecy in his epic poem, was to fight against the what he would call the vain enterprise, military enterprise of those days. So he is gradually disappointed with military career. He is wounded again there. He was twice wounded in India. This is quite extraordinary, but he must have been a man of a fantastic physical constitution. Normally, people would die in India after 10 years, very often. And having a wound used to be fatal. They could not control infection. Perhaps he benefited from the medical knowledge of his friend at the Jesuit hospital, perhaps. His friend Garcia da Horta, perhaps. In 1555, he asked the military governor, later viceroy, to be allowed to return to civilian status. And, you know, his demand is half granted. They said yes, but no money. Because they were needing soldiers anyway. So in 1558, he had some trouble with the administration because of a satirical comedy mocking the greedy administrators. Hi, hi. He wrote a comedy, just like his Plautus Latin models. And that was a satire. And people who were watching the comedy were being mocked on stage. Though, of course, it was a Greco-Latin comedy, but everybody understood. So again he was in trouble because of his frankness. And he was exiled from the Goan court to the Portuguese outpost of Macau. Now look at the map. Goa and Macau. You cannot go further as far as Portuguese posts were concerned. So Macau was an outpost, still benefiting of trade with the Chinese. Yes, Macau is very, very far. You see? Yes, exactly, near Hong Kong. But in those days, Macau was, you see, it was no more a Portugal stronghold. The Chinese wouldn't care. It was a beautiful base for trade. And everybody was profiting. Everybody. So the Portuguese, they had very early lost the political power, but in Macau the Jesuits were there anyway. And also the trade was going well with Portuguese cum Chinese vessels. Thanks to the Portuguese opening, you know, Japan and China were trading with the European world. Japan and China, they were closed society to the outer world. First of all, because they were afraid of the Mongol power, and secondly, because they came to know about the very strong Portuguese navy coming. Jesuits, again, were an exception. Jesuits were accepted for trade and for kind of university in Japan as well as in China's court. And I suppose that when Camões, when sent into exile to Macau with a very stupid title, you know, he was proveedor mor de defuntos y ausentes. So officially he was in charge of dead people and absent people. He would have to trace them and to make lists. That was a cushy job actually, because he would do nothing of the sort. Legend has it that he went to a cave and wrote most of his epics in the cave, which is against completely, you know, it must be, maybe it is symbolic, you know, with the Plato myth of the cave, going to the cave to reflect. I don't believe it. I don't believe it for a second. I'm quite sure that he benefited from the college, the Jesuit college in Macau. I have no proof for it. Just what I know of Jesuit college and what I know of Camões' needs of good books in Latin and Greek, etc. So he has this stupid job. He is removed from Goan politics. This was the major move against him. But again, it was a mixed one. He was not lacking of protection, because that was a cushy job actually. And his enemies in Goa, when the viceroy, the new viceroy, was completely his enemy from the court of Lisbon, he was taken back to Goa, going to jail again. The motives are not very clear. But we know that this new viceroy, he had an axe to grind with the family of of our poet. I'm sorry, I think I need a pause. Can we have a few minutes? Pause. Because there is a danger of me becoming bad and worse. Yeah, yes. Yes. And my throat is bad. You see, vous voyez, I should talk to you in English. Do you want? No? No, I will. This is... Non, ça va. Ça va, ça ira. Ça, j'ai acheté ça à Amsterdam. Sugar free. I'm sorry, but my throat is going bad also. गला खराब तो आवाज़ खराब.
गला काटने से
नहीं please. अभी नहीं. These are Vicks drop. Anybody wants? I can give one or two. I'm delaying my marriage for the sake of you. Patna is next door. I suppose this is clearer than yesterday, I hope. Because I had second thought, I said, what did I do? And my notes were very bad in my big, schoolboy, in my copybook. And because I have forgotten some of my books and archives in France. So what I reconstructed yesterday was not satisfactory for me. Sushant?
Because of my eye, my headache is getting intense. You spend it with us.
Where are you from, if I'm asked?
We
Indonesia.
have many students from
She is from Bhutan.
those two, they are from Bhutan. There is one boy also from Bhutan,
Uh-huh.
and
He is from Tripura.
he is from Sri Lanka,
Yes.
Apurana. You know what is Apurana?
Yes, it's
So they know most of the Sri Lankans.
Good. Twice I missed going to your country. It's a very sad story.
He is from Bhutan,
He is from Bhutan. He is from Myanmar.
and here is someone from Myanmar.
From Myanmar.
No,
Cambodia.
No, I always get it confused between you and Mario.
No, there is no confusion because Mario is not here. He is a monk, the other one is not a monk.
No, I get confused between their countries. He is from Myanmar,
He is from
but he is from Cambodia, so I get it mixed up sometimes.
So where is
Now we shall start again.
yeah,
So have you been to Kolkata?
To Portugal?
Kolkata. I am from Kolkata.
Oh yes, I remember. No, I missed it.
You should.
I flew to Calcutta just as a passing by.
Yes.
I regret. My Indian editor, my Indian publisher, he is from Calcutta. So his name is Chatterjee, you know.
Sorry, yes.
But I will be going there. At least I want to visit the National Library there.
Yes.
Still standing, right?
And also, yeah, it is still standing. And also, it's like you would be missing out on some really good food.
Fish, yes.
No, not just fish. It's very stereotypical of thinking like that, but not just fish. It is good in every cuisine and sweets.
Yeah, okay. All right. Shall we start?
Yes.
Are you all right? Yes? You had your personal break? Now you're gathering yourself? Because one thing is breaking, another thing is khatir jama rakho. Yes. Je pense que j'ai eu une bonne idée de refaire ça. Parce que j'étais pas du tout content de ce que j'avais fait. Et que j'ai laissé certaines choses en France que je regrette d'avoir laissées. Heureusement, ma tête fonctionne mieux que ma gorge. Sorry, this was private talk. So in 1560, Camões is taken as a prisoner to Goa. And he is taken on a Chinese ship and then on a galley. You know what a galley is? I don't think it was put on the rowing work. I don't think it was. Could have been. But in any way, he was taken, as a prisoner. No more good status. And then brought to Goa again. But on the way, he was shipwrecked. In Cambodia, by the way. In the mouth of the Mekong River, his ship, that was coming from China, it went to the bottom of the sea. He managed to escape. That is quite a miraculous thing. We don't know how he could swim from one arm and hold his Lusíadas from the other one. Legend has it that he did that. And then came to the shore and then dried the whole thing. Well, in any case, we know that he had his complete poem with him. Whether that was in Goa or somewhere else, it was completed. Say 80% of it was done. That we know from himself. So so he was not allowed to complete 3 years in Macau. You see, his enemies, the new viceroy, he had understood that that was too much of leniency to Camões. He should be brought back and in a very humiliating status as a prisoner, almost as a slave. He was shipwrecked in the coast of Cambodia in the delta of Mekong River and escaped from the shipwreck and managed to save the manuscript of the Lusíadas. Well, I'm not able to comment. Of course, this looks very fishy to me, especially about the sea. It's a fishy thing. In 1662, he is again he comes back to Goa in very bad conditions, and then he is again arrested briefly for a moment. He is free, but not far from the Inquisition arm. He is arrested and accused of malversations. The base of it was very simple. He was not deserving that cushy job in Macau. That would have been malversation. That would have been corruption. The very thing he has written against in his comedy, Philomena, in Goa. You remember? The comedy was against corruption of the officials. So he is accused of corruption himself. Anyway, in all times, in all governments, accusing somebody of corruption is a very classical thing, I would say. It's almost a tradition. So he was accused of a malversation, in jail for less than a year. We are not clear about it. Probably he would still have friends, namely the Jesuits, who probably interfered with the Inquisition. Probably. I do not know. There are so many, I would say, black spots on his biography. So many holes still to be filled. In 1562, he wrote a preface in poetry, an ode. Now, what is an ode? An ode is a long poem in praise of somebody, or in praise of a mountain, or of a river. But lately, more in praise of somebody. And his ode was in praise of his departed friend Garcia da Horta, whose book had been just printed by the Jesuits, Colloquio das Simples e Drogas, the dialogue of the medicinal plants and drugs. Drugs is a Persian word from daroga. Daroga was, at the Persian court, a person who was in charge of supplying so many things, food including medicine, daroga. Hence the English drug. So he was, Garcia da Horta had written the Colloquio dos Simples e Drogas. Like I told you yesterday, it was evidently inspired from Abu Alicina's book Kitabul Mufurdat. Fard in Arabic means individual. Somebody who is called Farid or Farida for a girl is like Monique in Greek, monos, simple, unique. So Fard was a simple plant, not a complex idea, just a simple remedy in medicine. And Mufurd is made simple. And Mufurdat is just the plural of it. And in Latin it was translated as, in English, as the simples. It means medicinal herbs. And drugs was the product of it, was the pharmacy. Interestingly enough, pharmakos in Greek means poison. See, a poison is also a medicine. It depends on the doses. So says classical medicine. So this was a very, very important book. But it was immediately condemned by the Inquisition on two grounds. First of all, because the church was being threatened, because you see, medicine, university were closely controlled by the church. It was forbidden for women to go there, first of all. And secondly, Arab medicine and Jewish medicine and New Greek medicine, they would not hesitate in opening bodies and making dissection. That was considered by the church as sacrilege. The body being useful for the day of resurrection. Hey, I wondered in what shape, but still. So, you see, the Inquisition, they were very much after this kind of work. In addition, Garcia da Horta was a Jew. But the interesting thing, as far as Camões is concerned, that was his first ever published poem. The rest of it was orally circulating or just manuscript. So his first ever published work is printed in India and takes him straight to jail, with his money taken off also. And I already told you, but I want to stress on the thing that Garcia da Horta was taken off from his tomb and his corpse was buried along with his surviving sister, who was burnt alive. She was his secretary. And again we have the fight between the university and Jesuit strongly backed university and publishing and the Inquisition. That kind of punishment, of savage punishment, was called in Portuguese auto da fé, an act of faith. Such a name. So Garcia da Horta, who had just passed away, is taken out of his sepulchre and his dead body is burnt in a symbolic auto da fé. And Garcia da Horta's sister, who had been his secretary and survived, is condemned to be burnt alive by the tribunal of the Inquisition. Camões is once again taken to jail. So this is quite ironic that his first ever published poetry, an ode to Garcia da Horta, leads him straight to jail. He has, in between the lines, he has allusions in his epics about his being perpetually persecuted. Mainly that is in the last stanzas of his epics. 1562-67, we do not know how long he remained in jail, but he continued to write poetry, thanks to us, thanks to probably his protections. Otherwise, he might have been, if he had not been protected by the university and by some powerful friends of his family, he might have been burnt as a supposedly Protestant and friend of the Jews. Finally, he is allowed to go back to Lisbon in 1567, but without any money. His money has been taken off by the Inquisition, and he goes back a pauper, while he had been dreaming of coming back as a rich man. He borrowed money to pay for his passage on a vessel, but he is left stranded in Mozambique. So the owner and captain of the ship, in those days the captain would be the owner of the ship and the real captain was the pilot. Anyway, he had borrowed money from that person to pay for his passage. And then when he come to Mozambique, that was the first stopover, he is told by the captain, who was an enemy of his family, I want my money back. Otherwise, you don't carry on to Lisbon. So he had no money. And he is left stranded on the beach, so to speak, in Mozambique, in Mombasa. And what does he do there? Well, he writes again. And fortunately, one of his friends, a very famous chronicler, you know what is a chronicler? A chronicler is? No, a chronicler is an historiographer, a writer of history paid by the king, not an independent one. Is quite close to the epic writer in that sense. So Diogo do Couto was his personal friend, and he also has a stopover in Mozambique, and Diogo do Couto pays his debts and takes him along to Lisbon. In any case, when he comes to Lisbon, he is still without any money and any prospect. His only status is he has paid his debts and he has brought his major work with him. That is all. So Diogo do Couto later reported that he was still working on his epic poem, even stranded in Mozambique. This is an important testimony that we have. And he must have been preparing his sort of welcoming to Lisbon court already in Mozambique, And we suspect, we even know through internal analysis, that while being with Diogo do Couto, he sort of corrected so many historical allusions of his epics. Because Diogo do Couto, in his History of Asia, had also covered part of the history of Portugal. It was a must. So, thanks to the help of Diogo do Couto, he corrects his epics, at least so many historical allusions. And another thing is, we suppose that he must have seen the manuscript of a very important work on Asia, on so-called Portugal Asia, by Castaneda. So Castaneda writings on Asia were never published before end of 19th century, long after they were written. They were not allowed to be published. But we know that Camões had a private reading. He read the manuscripts of Castaneda while in Asia. Castaneda wrote in Asia in Portuguese for more than 35 years. And those are very precious writings, because Castaneda was working with converted former Portuguese or Muslim Jews who were his interpreter. Himself, Castaneda, has learnt Arabic and Persian also. 35 years in India, and Arabic was not so much fashionable. What was fashionable was Persian. So the writings of Castaneda are very, very accurate, very often critical against the Portuguese power, because he also suffered of it. In Castaneda, you find so many things about the sultans of Gujarat, which is nowhere else to be found, because the Mughal had wiped out the scene, and then the Portuguese also. But so many things are preserved there in Castaneda regarding the Muslim and Hindu dynasties of the time. And Camões was allowed to look at it. It explains why his epics are so well informed about recent Portuguese and Indian history. Though it is still poetry, with exaggeration, with so-called prophecies, but still those connection of Camões with Castaneda, with Diogo do Couto and others explain, in addition to his great knowledge, it explains the richness of his epic poem, and also his critical views of political and military power of the Portuguese in Asia. Uh, 1567, 1568, from Mozambique to Lisbon at last. So he comes penniless, but he has his book with him. 1568, 70, probably revised his book, and also with access on books about India again. He had to convince the church, and how much time do I have left?
Sir, it's only 12:15.
So I have finished. No.
You can continue for 15-20 minutes.
Okay. So he had to convince the church and the king in order to obtain a license to go to print. 1571, the license to go to print is signed, Alvara Regio, the royal license, with an opinion from the Inquisition. So he corrected very well. He added some passages to his epics, and he had offered a copy to the King Dom Manuel. Dom means Dominus. All Portuguese kings, they had the title of Dom, D-O-M, Dominus, master. Contrary to the Spanish kings. Whatever the Spaniards would do, the Portuguese wouldn't do. Though they were almost the same people, but it's like that. 1571, along with the license to go to the print, he is given a stipend for 3 years, 15,000 reis only. Actually, the stipend was for 3 years only. And after a few years of misery, he died in poverty. Now I would come to some concluding remarks. I might not have time to talk about Kletu, Ave Kletu, because I apologize, sir.
Tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you. Because of my badly done work, so I had to rectify. I think conclusions are very important. I thought of it, some remarks. With Camões, epics are no longer composed orally and no longer sung in publics by bards. This is the reality, and it is important to think that the printing press changed completely the attitude of people towards literature. Of course, in epic poems, we still have what I would call traces of orality. Thank God. Bless you, my child, bless you. So, we have traces of orality. What are they? In Camões' Lusíadas. First of all, he has recounted, he has narrated stories he heard. That is some trait, that is some trace of orality. It is not totally absent of it. And also, Camões was still able to recite passages in order to convince people. One of the last time he did was in the convent of Santa Cruz, his uncle's convent, where the church was very much present and not the Inquisition. So we have a picture of his in that convent. Remember, his uncle was the prior to that convent and also the chancellor of Coimbra University. Not vice chancellor, chancellor. Very important thing. So we have a picture of him in 1570-71 with the monks assembled and listening to him in the cloister, and then he reads aloud. Does not recite anymore, reads aloud. So you see, poetry, like the whole of literature, epic poetry also, has been deeply transformed by the printing press. Still, the relationship to the emperor or to the power is still there, because the emperor or the king has the key to the printing press. But the power of the press, the power of the Jesuits, the power of the Protestant ideas was so strong that the king could not anymore control it. So the Inquisition was called for help. Anyway, he has to compromise between these powers, and he takes 1 year, perhaps 2 years, to revise his text and to have passages to please Peter and Paul, if I may say. Epics are written first, no more oral literature, even if certain heritage is preserved. Now with Virgile, contrary to Homer, with Virgile we have also an important paper played by the written form already. But Virgile still needed music and needed to recite aloud to the emperor without paper even. That is finished with printing press. even if certain heritage is preserved, like I told you, we have marks of oral tradition. Of course, an important mark is the utility of poetic form, the stanza, the Italian stanza. It is a short poem of 8 verses, 10 syllables, easy to remember. You see, you count your syllables 10, so I'm not wrong. And 8 is not such a big quantity that you can remember and write easily. So the basic stanza, to stand, the basic stanza is, I would say, still a trace of orality. So we have the utility of poetic form, the constant reminders and songs interlinked. What I call constant reminders is when in the classical form, whether it would be in India or in Europe, northern, southern Europe, you had what is called a bard. The bard is not necessarily author, but could be a co-author, and the bard would chant the epics with a sitar, or he would have somebody with him. So the bard would sing. Now, when you have 10,000 verses, well, you need sometimes help. And you wouldn't sing an epic in one go. One evening, oh yes, you were correct about the word sarau yesterday. It would exist already in those times. I apologize. You were correct for a literary evening, sarau, in Portuguese. So you would need more than one sarau, more than one evening, perhaps 10 or 20 evenings to finish with the epic poem. So you see, the audience and even the bard would not perhaps remember well what had been said before. Bards is the singer. Yes. B-A-R-D. So there was a technique which is typical of oral literature, is you have reminders. Listen, remember Ulysses, what he did last time. He did so and so. And what did the gods say? Oh, they said that. Do you remember? So I'm going to tell you again. And then you are again in the proper set of mind to follow the story again. So these constant reminders, repetitions, we still have them in the epic poem of Camões. This is another very important trace of orality, and it is even needed in the printed form, because you cannot, it's quite difficult to read the Lusíadas at a go. I defy you to do so, even in English, even in Hindi, it's. So you need pauses, and you need repetition, and you need what I call reminders. Even in written, you see, the oral tradition is still there. And songs are interlinked. When you have a song about Adamastor, the monsters of the sea, well, you might link it with another maritime adventure so that you are not lost. You don't lose the thread. You please remind me tomorrow. I will have a special talk about monsters. They are very much needed. even if we want to be put to sleep, you know. Epics in Camões and others in Camões times are getting smaller. Just look at the quantity of books and verses. Homer, Iliad and Odyssey, each of them is 24 books. Virgile is only 12. Camões only 10. And there is a reason for that. Printing is very expensive, paper is very expensive, and it is no more orality. You don't need to repeat so much. You don't need to have so many evenings and mornings, you know, with the bard. So it becomes a smaller affair, but still quite lengthy, because you have so many things to say, and you have to please so many people, and you have to recount so many glorious deeds of the heroes. So it has to be long anyway. And an interesting thing, the stanzas are regrouped in songs. Still, they are called songs, not books. With the printed form, we start talking of book first, book two, first book, third book. Gradually, the idea of song is rejected. Not in Camões' time. He still has canto primeiro, canto segundo, canto terceiro, quarto, quinto, sexto, sétimo. You see, I can still count in Portuguese. I never forget, anyway. But after that, later, people, whenever they write epics, they talk of books. Filiation with Virgile and Greco-Roman tradition formally maintained. Oh, that was a question of izzat, a question of honor. Because if you wanted to be accepted by the good society, you couldn't be totally revolutionary. You couldn't break the idols. You couldn't sort of put Virgile and Homer in the Gemini, in the heads. No, 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 no. You had still to revere the tradition. So you had to use Greco-Roman mythology. And that was very handy, you know, sort of hitting at the Catholic mythology. Remember what I told you in the beginning, that writing about history, writing about Greek and Roman mythology was a direct hit at the Flos Sanctorum, at the tradition, medieval tradition in Europe of writing about the life of the saints. No, sir, we have heroes. So tradition is formally maintained with Virgin and Greco-Roman tradition, and even if they wouldn't have music, they would still sometimes manage to have music anyway. A very interesting thing is from 16th century onwards, Greek and Roman epics are transformed into operas with music, dance, and some dialogues. So the oral tradition is not totally lost. The heroic tradition is not totally lost in opera forms. Dido and Aeneid Dido and Aeneas is a very famous opera by an English composer. My mind is failing. It's all right. It's not a very important point anyway. English literature is not my point today. Purcell, Henry Purcell. Yeah, Purcell. Am I wrong? I don't think I am. Yes. Yes. My head is still working. So, Henry Purcell wrote a fantastic opera with music very much inspired by Spanish music, by the way, and Italian music that was fashionable in England. And his famous opera is Dido and Aeneas. So you see, epics still survive in so many other forms. In novels, in operas, but there is an important point. Submission to supreme political power, the king, continues, although the author is encouraging other people. You see, the modern authors, modern, 16th, 17th century, they still have to pay due respect to the king. But the nobility has become, thanks to colonialism in Asia, what I call first colonialism. They had become filthy rich. And becoming rich means having a poetical court. And we have a multiplication of poetical courts in 16th and 17th century in Spain and Portugal. So there are different openings for epic poems, including the university, because the university has a soft corner for classical writings, epics, Homer and Virgile. So they welcome new epics. And now I had yesterday an idea. You should know that when I was young, when I was younger than you, how old are you, may I ask? 24. So I was, I think, 21 when I was in Salamanca, which was one of the first universities of Spain, an enemy of the Inquisition. So in Salamanca, a man, a former soldier, Spanish soldier, Alonso de Ercilia, wrote an epic poem called La Araucana around 1560, 1559, I don't remember well, but it's in those years. And that was printed in Salamanca with the blessing of the university, of course. Now, what was La Araucana? It was written by a former soldier. Look at Camões. And it was written about long, long battles between the coming Spanish power in Argentina, in what is now Argentina, in Chile, sorry. And also in Argentina. Also in Argentina. The Mapuches. Yes. So the Araucana is the tale and the epic song of huge battles that was sometimes lost battles by the Spaniards, and Ercilia, who had been himself a soldier there, thought fair to remember. So we have the new kind of bard, the new kind of authors, former soldiers, the soldier poet. And that is a new fact. And I thought of Alonso de Ercilia very late at night. I remember I thought to myself, whom could I compare Camões with? Then I have La Araucana at home, but it is still in my head also. So I thought that there is a comparison to be done. Now we cannot do it because it is not in your program. But I would recommend to you people to read about the life of Alonso de Ercilia. Alonso is just like Alfonso. In classical Spanish, F disappears completely under Basque influence. In Basque language, there was no F. And Alfonso becomes Alonso. So Alonso de Ercilia, who was a Basque, I think, and he had also an axe to grind with the Spaniards. So I would invite you to learn about Alonso de Ercilia, Ercilla, about his life as a poet cum soldier, or a soldier cum poet. Malikun, ek minute. I wrote a short note in Spanish. I didn't have time to translate into French or whatever. La Araucana de Alonso de Ercilia is an epic poet, Salamanca 1574. And you see, it is not a coincidence that it was produced in Salamanca and printed in Salamanca. And somewhere I have a portrait of Alonso de Ercilia, which is very, very similar. You remember the portrait of Camões with the Renaissance frame? So I have exactly the same portrait, with coat of arms and book. So it's an epic poem printed in Salamanca in 1574. 1574, almost the same year with the Lusíadas in Portugal. Very similar place and year. Salamanca is not far from Portugal, by the way. And it is narrating the first phase of the conquest of Chile, and especially the war of Arauco. Arauco is supposed to be an Amerindian chief between Spaniards and Mapuches, including episodes like the capture of Pedro de Valdivia. Pedro de Valdivia was a so-called Spanish conqueror who had been taken prisoners by the Mapuches. So, you see, we have epic poems at the very same time who are not entirely praising the colonial enterprise. I have finished. Thank you. For today.
Questions?
Yes. You,
Did it influence how the Indian people accepted the foreign knowledge? Like
you see,
like,
thank you for your question. We're a bit out of the impetus of epic poems, but it is linked. It is linked, of course. That is the responsibility, the sole responsibility of the Jesuits. Because the school of thought of the Jesuits was to convince the elite. Now, it was quite difficult to bring about theology, because bringing about theology, you bring a knowledge that is not entirely logical, therefore very difficult to accept. So instead of theology, what the Jesuits did, they adapted the credo. You know what the credo is? The symbol of faith. La ilaha, etc. I hope I'm not offending you. So the Christian credo was credo in unum Deum. I believe in one single God. But the Catholic, they would add the Holy Spirit and the Trinity, which was in Muslim eyes not acceptable, by the way. The Holy Trinity was God, the Father, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. So, this much the Portuguese in those days, they managed to translate, and the first language, first Indian language they used was Tamil. Tamil, yes. And later on Konkani as well, but Tamil was first, because Tamil was very, very important as far as Hindu philosophy was concerned in those days. And you see, their contact was mostly with South Indian people and the Coromandel coast, and Tamil people had very deep exchanges with the Arabs, or so-called Arabs. In reality, they were Persian, but then. Oh, everybody knows Madras, right? Madras is the Arabic plural of madrasa. It was Madaris. I hope it is some news for you. But you see, the Persian, mainly the Persian Shia, were very strong in the southern coast of India. And those, they were well equipped to fight the Jesuit enterprise. So theology was not really something the Jesuits would have used. They mostly did it a very astute way. They translated and adapted basic theology, that is prayers, from Greek and Latin to Chinese to Indian languages, and that was very successful. So successful it was that the church in Rome, some parts of the church in Rome, they had a problem. Oh, they are modifying the rites, and Latin is no more a sacred language for them. And that was very astute on part of the Jesuit. But for that, they needed education, you see. They needed a school for Persian. They needed a school for Latin, etc. So in that way, they did present some some part of Christian theology, but it was not their main weapon. Did I answer you? कोई और प्रश्न, कोई और सवाल? Another question? Yes, sir. Oh, I have seen you also. Yes.
Lusíadas, who is the villain?
Sorry.
In epic, there is a must be a hero,
Yes.
must be a villain. So last day you mentioned about the monster.
Yes.
So
In classical epics, there are villains. True. In the Lusíadas, we don't have real villains. That is very interesting. Even the monster Adamastor, he becomes a kind of prophet. Of course, he's a monstrous creature. But at the end, you see, the Portuguese ask him, Quem és tu? Who art thou? And then he said, I am the mountain. And I predict you that you will have so and so bad battles, etc. You see, the villains are not real villains anymore. One thing. And second thing, even in Homer, heroes, you see, you have heroes, but not real villain. You know, the Trojan heroes are not considered as villain. They are enemies, which is a different thing. Aeneas is mentioned quite a few times, though he is supposed to be the arch enemy of the Greeks. Aeneas is described as a good fighter, as a valiant fighter. Villains, yes, there is one villain in the Lusíadas, that is Bacchus. No, the god of wine, Bacchus. So he is a real villain. He is the enemy of Venus, and in classical Roman literature, Bacchus was supposed to be an oriental god. He was supposed to have conquered India. So he is a villain somewhere. But he has a very limited role.
So, sir, last year lecture, you have been mentioned that.
Last year?
Yeah, last year Lusíadas lecture. You have been mentioned that Vasco da Gama is the hero and the Arab pilot who is supposed to be the villain.
Yes, but not throughout the Lusíadas. You see, they had a political problem because everybody knew that the best pilots were Muslim pilots, because they did not believe that the earth was the center of the universe. They would follow the stars, and they had understood that. So they were very much useful to the European, but they would not acknowledge it. So Ibn Majid was probably a Gujarati Muslim pilot working for the Shah Bandar in Mozambique. You know Shah Bandar, the regent of the port. Shah Bandar. Samudrai. So he was working for him, and he was lended to Vasco da Gama with the promise of being well paid, and on his side with the promise of taking Vasco da Gama to India. He had the knowledge, etc. But then after, you see, the Portuguese, they did whatever they could so that Ibn Majid would be forgotten or would be depicted as a traitor. Not anymore in the Lusíadas. In the beginning, they have, you see, veiled allusion as possibly bad intentions from Ibn Majid. But on the whole, Ibn Majid is a positive character in Camões. Camões was not stupid. He was criticized for that, of course. Yes, just 1 second.
Let us answer is one more question.
Sir, with the reference of that.
That is fine, sir.
Yeah.
I think I have answered you.
Yeah, you answered, but I have one question.
No, but other people are having questions. Because otherwise, no, I'm sorry.
Yes, sir.
You're welcome to ask me tomorrow also. Yes?
About the two printed versions, 71 and 72, are different?
Yes. 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 There are small differences, printing errors mostly. But we discovered later that we have a third edition, a pirated one.
Do we know how many copies they
We don't know. We don't know.
popular at that time?
No. That was for the elite. Just remember that hardly 1% of the population could read. Hardly 1%. So perhaps you would have 100 copies at the maximum. At the maximum. And that was the treasured thing. It would be immensely, would I say, expensive. And we discovered later, I think 20 years ago, something like that, that we had some pirated edition that were circulated without the author's permission, without the king of the church permission. At least 2 pirated editions.
But were there some meetings in which they read aloud the books?
No, because that was too dangerous. That could be done outside of the court. It couldn't be done outside of the court. And you see, you would present the king the book, the king would read or would have had read to him, and in small committees people would commend the book. But it was very dangerous to have public gathering about a book.
So
You wouldn't have.
at that time we don't have like bookstores. Like in Roman time we have bookstores.
Yes, but you see, that is a different thing. In Roman times, we have stores, but not in the commercial way. You see, not very much. There was a trade of manuscripts, yes, but not an official one. Not an official one. And big families in Roman times, they were storing volumini, manuscripts. Yes, they were storing them. They were buying them, not selling them. Of course, some people, the profession was writing and selling. And even in the beginning of printing techniques and times, the printer and the publisher was the same person, with the church overlooking, with the king overlooking. Yes? No?
Yes, sir.
Yes?
So in Lusíadas, like we see in the other epics of Homer and Virgile, like
Yes.
other epics, like we see that it usually begins with invocation.
Yes.
So does Lusíadas?
Yes, of course. There is an invocation, and tomorrow I'll show you it again. Show it again.
What is the capacity of divine intervention within the epic? Because
You see, invocation
And
at the time of Camões, it is no more religious. It is political.
So it's more of
Yeah, it is.
history based.
Yes, these are my intention, says Camões. I will sing the men, I will sing the Vasco da Gama's big adventures, I will sing it, and I will sing about other men also.
So, but then again, does it justify as an epic? Because
It does. It does. Sorry to say. Because it is done anyway in the name of spreading religion. You see, officially. Officially.
But he used mythology politically.
Yes, of course.
So, and in other cases, for example,
You see, I'm bothered with this. Please speak louder.
for example, but in other cases at that time, because for example, this you mentioned La Araucana.
Yes.
They use also mythology as a political thing or just ornamental thing. There were other authors.
I cannot answer this question because I mentioned the Araucana as an interesting parallelism with the poet-soldier or soldier cum poet and the new kind of epics with printing. But I cannot answer you really because my memory is not good enough of my readings. When I go home, I'll take off my book again, I'll read it, and then come back here and tell you.
I think he had one more question.
Yes, now?
What is the notion of villain in epic? And if there is no the notion of villain, the concept of villain in the Lusíadas, then it is epic or not?
It is not really. What I would think is the anti-hero. You see, some heroes are enemies, but they are not really villains. They have good qualities. And by the way, if your enemy is a good warrior, then your glory is bigger.
like for example, you take Karna from her.
But I think this concept of villain is more related with
But there is a definition of
contemporary.
epic. No?
Huh?
But there is a definition of epic where we mention that notion of villain. Several times we also talk
Yes,
about
but I would say that villain is not really a villain. He is a noble villain, sort of. Yeah.
So it's
I
not
think more
important.
related with the movies, with the kind of
Yes, Moors.
contemporary.
Yes, Moors were the villain. Yes, yes, true. Yeah, but that was a collective villain, I would say. And again, if we look at some precise writing by Camões with the King of Melinda, etc., he says that we better consider these people as potential traders, not enemies.
Sir, I have another question.
One second. Anybody else?
Sir, I have another question. That is, if since Vasco da Gama is shown as being discovering the lands.
Yes.
Lands, so can we give him or say him as he being the anti-hero of the epic since he's capturing the indigenous lands in a way?
No. No.
Or are
No.
we glorifying
No.
him over here?
It's all right. It's all right. Let me tell you about my studies when I was younger than you, when I used to study history of Portugal and history of Spain under fascist regime. In France we didn't have fascist regime, but I don't think that colonial France was a very nice democratic regime anyway. So, for example, in my copy of the, that is 1964, of the Lusíadas, we still had an advertisement for the professors not to teach this and this and this part of the epic poem. So I don't know if it answers you, but in those days there was still among the fascist regime in Spain and Portugal the idea of so-called discoveries. Yes, they might not be real discoveries, but it was a good thing. For example, my first book of Spanish literature, anthology, there was a big chapter about La Araucana, about the conquering of Latin America. Guess what was the title of the chapter, which is no more now? La Obra Magna. The great deed. La Obra Magna. And we had to sit quietly. You see? So things have changed dramatically after the fall of Franco and the fall of Salazar. Of course, we still have people who read Camões and other epics like the one by Ercilia. We still have people who venture to say, yes, it was a beautiful work. It's difficult, you see, to stick to pure literary history and tradition and form. From one moment or another, you have to choose your political options. Now, do we call it a day? Sir? A question from you?
Yes, I was continuously thinking that the legends that we have about Camões,
Yes.
is it really mediated by the fascist regimes that we have?
Yes, yes.
Apparently it should be that.
Yes, yes, it was. It was propagated because
He writes about this aspect, but it should be that very natural.
yes, yes. Like I told you the Obra Magna. Yes, that I'm a witness to it.
No, that is there in France.
No, in Spain, in Portugal. Yes, I was in Spain by those days. I was a direct witness to it. The fascist propaganda recycling the 16th century epics.
The fascist propaganda had the last Latin epic Sunny Yucca. You sent me the
Yeah?
from that.
Oh, yes. Oh, by the way,
Fascist regime. Yes.
I started photographing my beautiful fount of Greek and Latin mythology, the Metamorphoses. I started making photography for you, and my camera broke. So I have the 4 pages for you if you want. But I will. There has been a new edition of Metamorphoses. I will send it to you. A nice one. Because mine is 19th century and full of, propaganda actually.
No, but that is also important because even now that propaganda aspect of epic is very important.
Yes, yes.
I'm sure
Yes.
Even today, the storytelling is a very important propaganda as well as a espionage device.
Yes, of course. It's a political device.
It's a political
Yes.
or rather politico-economic device. Well, political device means a
Well, with cinema it pays.
yes, with cinema.
It pays. Yes.
And also you try to create new markets.
The Italian regime of Mussolini made a huge amount of money by creating the first ever festival of cinema and the first ever films devoted to Hercules. Hercules was Mussolini. Not the contrary.
And even today, if you look at the film festivals or even the prizes that you get this prize, they are part of the same political game.
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. You give prize for, first of all, the merit is there, but, okay, खाना तैयार है. We had food for thought, now we have thought for food.
So today, no, let us have one photo before you all leave.
Okay.
Yes.
I'll call Aman.